Hello everyone, my name is Phoenix, and in this video I will tell you about the new Projectiles mod. This mod allows you to create new types of projectiles and change their behavior. The mod itself doesn't make change to the game, all the work is done through JSON files. The mod has a wide range of functions that can be combined to modify projectiles' behavior. Before diving into these functions, let's first take a look at the file structure. To begin this, I highly recommend validating your JSON using a schema. This will help you catch errors during editing and get hints from your IDE. The file template looks like this. There is only one mandatory section, triggers. This section describes the events and conditions that activate the mod's functions. I'll get back to this later, but for now, let's create a simple trigger. As you can see, triggers is an array of objects. I'll create an empty object. In it, you need to specify the event property. It defines when the mod's function will be triggered. I'll set the value to ProjAppeared, which means it will execute every time a new projectile appears in the game. The second mandatory property is trigger functions, which determines what functions will be triggered. In the functions array, you list all the functions that should be activated by this trigger. Now let's take a look at the first function, homing. It controls projectile aiming while flight. You can make any projectile this type, even if it's already in flight. Homing types are configured through the homing data property. This is an associative array of objects that you will reference by keys. The keys should start with key underscore. It's important to specify the type of homing and its parameter. You can read more about this in the documentation. The aggressive parameter sets an aggression filter when selecting a target. By default, the projectile aims only on aggressive targets, but for testing purposes you can disable this filter. You can also configure other parameters, such as the method of target selection and the visibility filter. So, we've set up the homing function. Let's return to the triggers and add link to our setting instance to the trigger. We specify the function name setHoming and the argument ID. Now every projectile that appears in the game will become homing with our settings. You can experiment with intensity of homing. For the const ACCEL time, this is controlled by the acceleration parameter. You can read more about the types of homing and their intensity parameters in the documentation. With this intensity setting, the projectile homes fairly well, but might miss. By increasing the value, you'll achieve more reliable hits. Note that I'm not restarting the game, I'm using a hotkey to reload the JSON. You can set this up in the settings. If you only need to make minor adjustments, reduce the value. That's the homing feature. The Multicast function controls projectile launching. You can launch several projectiles simultaneously, specifying the spell, positions, and directions. The function settings are stored in the Multicast data property. This is also an associative array with spawn group launching parameters. For example, if you set the spell ID property to current, the projectiles will be on the same type as the original projectile that triggered the function. In this case, you won't be able to launch this function with an arrow projectile. Next, in the spawn group property, you need to specify the key of the spawn group settings instance, which is defined in Multicast spawn groups. Here you define the pattern that determines the positions and directions of the projectiles. The figure field determines the shape type. Set shape field to single. This spawn group places one projectile in the same location where the trigger activated. In our case, this is where the projectile appeared. To see the function's effect, you'll need to shift the spawn group. Otherwise, two projectiles will appear in the same spot, the original and the spawned one. Use the pose offset field of the pattern object. This will shift it 100 units upward. Now, when the projectile appears, the multicast function will be triggered. You can test it out. As you can see, a second projectile appears parallel to the first one. You can create more interesting shape than a single cast, such as a circle. Change the shape field and set the size. To prevent the original projectile from launching, use Disable Origin flag in the Triggers function property. Let me show you a more interesting example. I'll create a new spawn group. The shape type is half circle. Then I specify the size and number of projectiles. I'll raise it higher again. Next, I'll specify the projectile's direction, which by default aligns parallel to the spawn group. Now I'll set it to two-side, meaning it will point towards where the caster is looking. You can create a second group. Let it launch a belt of projectiles flying in different directions. To rotate the plane horizontally, I'll use the normal property, pointing it upwards. To make it independent of the vertical component of the looking direction, I'll use the x-depends flag. This function has a lot of possibilities and flexible settings. I've only shown you part of it. You can find more detailed examples and documentation for further exploration. The next function, followers, allows you to make projectiles your companions. Settings instances are stored in the followers data property. You specify the positions the projectile should follow. Let's make a projectile that flies over your head. It will follow the point above you, also maintaining your direction. Let's create a protective ring, allowing the projectiles to rotate around you. Set the rotation type and radius. You can adjust the collision, speed, and rotation type. Followers by themselves are not very useful, but with the emitter function they can perform miracles. This feature allows you to execute functions while the projectile is in flight. Let's create a projectile that fires downward as it flies. I'll create a settings instance as usual. In the interval field, I'll specify the frequency. The functions field will contain the functions. For now, it will launch a multicast. I'll create a spawn group, specify all the IDs, and direct the normal downward. Let's create a defender projectile. It will fly over your head and shoot at everyone. The projectile will be both a follower and an emitter. In the settings, specify the multicast ID. In the span group, use the rotation property to aim it towards the target. Specify the ID from the homing feature. Now the projectile will follow you while simultaneously triggering the multicast function, which will direct projectiles at your enemies. You can change the shape to a sphere, where each subsequent projectile will take its place. These are the basic functions of the mod. I've left out many settings to keep the video simple. It's more of an overview than a detailed tutorial. Experiment, create new combinations, and I'm looking forward to see your mods.